Welcome to worship at Sky Island Unitarian Universalist Church in Sierra Vista, Arizona. I am the Reverend Tina Squire, and I invite you, no matter whenever or wherever you join us from, please bring your whole self to worship here today. Today, in this recording, I can't include all of worship. I can't record the beautiful hymn playing of Gene McKean, for example. And yet, I hope these snippets will suffice, just as the very few stories we can include today, celebrating National Coming Out Day, are not enough to cover the entire experience of everyone who's contemplated coming out or has done so. But hopefully these stories will encourage you to think and to think about this topic more than just once a year. If you have a chalice or candle nearby, will you light it with me as I light mine? And say these words written by Enfleshed, a group dedicated to bringing spiritual nourishment and collective liberation to those who want to know more about queer theology. Here are some words from them. Once upon a time, they could say they didn't know us, but not anymore. Here we are, bringing our sacred strange into their pews and pulpits, to their dinner tables, and beside them in waiting rooms and checkout lines. No apologies. They are so lucky to have us here. It has become our custom every week to make an acknowledgement about the fact that the land we are on was stolen from other peoples. And October 11th is not only National Coming Out Day, but also Indigenous Peoples Day. And so I want to acknowledge that where we are was once inhabited by Subaipuri and Otham and Opata and Apache. Indigenous peoples live here still. It's a complicated story, but it's one that needs to inform how we steward this land together with such groups. Recently, my 15-year-old son introduced me to a movie he really likes, and now I do too, called Luca, about a sea monster by that name who lives along the coast of Italy. Luca discovers that if he stands on dry ground, he stops having green skin and fins and purple hair and starts to look like a brown-haired, brown-eyed boy. He meets a slightly older sea monster who's living by himself on an island, pretending to be human, and Alberto invites Luca to go with him to a coastal community of humans. They swim over, they get out, they dry off, and they become human. They are absorbed into the family of a young girl and her father who take them in, and Luca starts to enjoy school and wants to continue. But there's a catch. If they get wet, these sea monster boys once again get their flippers, their fins, their purple hair, and reveal themselves to be sea monsters, which is dangerous for them in that town. All over the walls and doors are plastered posters inviting people to kill sea monsters for a reward. One day, Alberto gets wet and everyone sees him for the sea monster he is. And Luca has a moment to decide what to do, and he jumps back and he says, sea monster. He abandons his friend, he continues to pass, and Alberto has to swim off by himself away from the town. Luca has been training for a competition, and he takes part in it. It involves biking and swimming. And for the swimming part, he dons an old-fashioned diving costume, complete with metal helmet and opaque glass shield in front of his eyes, so nobody can see that when he swims, he changes color and form. But things happen during the competition. It starts to rain. And at one point, in my favorite moment, two older women who've been walking throughout the movie, looking very dignified and very traditional and looking down a little bit at people they meet and maintaining the rules. In the middle of this competition, in the middle of the rain, they turn and look at each other, and they pull down their umbrellas and reveal that they too are sea monsters. I love this movie because it shows how hard it can be sometimes, how dangerous it can be to be our full selves. And each one of us, I am certain, has something that we have had to hide. When I was a little kid, I lived in Russia. I went to Orthodox services where we stayed up late and chanted and used incense. I went to mosques where people left their shoes outside in reverence. I saw temples where people left offerings. And then I moved to my mother's hometown in Massachusetts. And if I spoke about living in Russia, I was called Kami and Pinko, and certainly I couldn't talk about other religious traditions. And then we moved to Washington, D.C., where many people lived from all over the world. And I took part in a church that took me to a monastery, to a Hindu temple, to an Islamic center where people left their shoes out in respect. And I felt like more of myself and who I was could be present at that church. We all have things we've had to hide and can only share in certain company. Today, celebrating National Coming Out Day, of course, we want to focus on those for whom it has been hard to embrace their gender, their sexual orientation, their place in the world. People who've had to hide and pass to stay safe. Think about what that means. Think about what it takes to find the safe place and the courage to show your full self. And I wonder how we, as a community, can invite more of everything people are to be present in our midst. I want to thank the Reverend Linda Lawrence, former pastor at Sky Island, for having posted this week a beautiful poem on Facebook. It's by the transgender poet, activist, educator, speaker, Jay Holm, and it's part of a collection of books he just published called The Backwater Sermons. And in this poem, Holm later explains that he is making reference to a story in Christian scripture. It's actually in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And it's the story of the woman with a flow of blood. She has been hemorrhaging for 12 years, which means she was considered unclean and unable to be out in society, out among people. She certainly was not to go up to a strange man, a holy man, and touch him. But she's desperate. She's in the crowd and she goes up to him and she thinks, if I just touch his garment, I'll be healed. And so she does. And immediately she does feel that she stopped bleeding and she's whole again. But Jesus feels energy leaving his body and he turns around and says, "Who touched me?" And his followers laugh because there are dozens of people crowding up right next to him. How can he ask who touched him? But he keeps wondering. And so she realizes she's the one. She comes forward, she kneels down, she's trembling in fear, and she says to him the whole story. And he turns to her and says, "Daughter, you took a risk of faith, and now you're healed and whole. Live well, live blessed, be healed of your plague. It's a beautiful moment that Jesus doesn't feel unclean, doesn't worry about that, celebrates her healing. In Holmes' poem, Jesus is at a gay bar and he's dancing and he's got his robe hitched up so he can spin better. And a young boy comes up begging to be healed, begging to be anything but what he is. And Jesus turns around, cups the boy's face in his hands and says, "My beautiful child, there is nothing in this heart of yours that ever needs to be healed." So it takes the story from Mark and Matthew and Luke and flips it. Jesus doesn't even heal, and that is more healing. Could you imagine a place where people are celebrated for who they are, where their whole self is whole and welcome? Today, as we consider National Coming Out Day, we know that everybody has a different story, that people come out at different times because of their social location and their geography. That could influence people greatly. And while some statistics show that people who are younger are coming out younger, it's not always true. I have met men who've waited to their 50s and people of another generation who came out at 19 and 20. It just depends on your perception of safety, of the right time, of how you'll be received. A few years ago, Rachel Maddow interviewed Pete Buttigieg as he was running for president, and she pointed out to him that in 1995, she applied and was accepted as the first openly gay American into the Rhodes Scholarship Program to go study at Oxford. She pointed out that Pete also applied and became a Rhodes Scholar a decade later, but you never came out. And then you went into the military and you never came out. And then you became mayor of South Bend, Indiana, and you still weren't out. Finally, as you took on a second run, you did come out. And the votes you received were higher the second time than the first. And Buttigieg says, yeah, it took me longer. It took me longer. I was 33. My husband, Chasten, was in his 20s. We're both from small Midwestern areas. We felt that it was dangerous. We didn't know if we'd be accepted. He wished he had been able to come out sooner and live less of a restricted life, but he hadn't felt safe. For everybody, it's different. And it can be tricky if you are a person of color. There's a really good podcast that Sam Sanders of It's Been a Minute does October 9th, 2018, in preparation for the National Coming Out Day of October 11th that year. He interviews people about their coming out stories, and he talks to two different scholars about the complexity, especially for Black men, about coming out. First, he explores the history with Professor Marcy Gallo, Associate Professor of History at the University of Nevada in Las Vegas, and she specializes in race, gender, sexuality, and social justice movements. So they talked about when did the gay rights movement start? And she said, let's not look just at the 60s. Let's look even earlier. Post-World War II, society had changed deeply and pervasively, and people had just fought a war against hate. And so groups started to stand up for themselves and claim a hate-free world for themselves. That there's a connection between the gay rights movement and the civil rights movement as well. He also talks to E. Patrick Johnson about what it is that makes it so hard for African-American men, especially, to come out. Sam Sanders says, I always thought this kind of big, grand coming out was a white thing. It was available to white men, but not so much to me. And Johnson says, well, look at the history. Look at what happened in slavery when women were raped, had children out of rape, had their children taken from them. Men were lynched or had limbs lopped off if they were accused or believed to have looked at a white woman. In other words, as Johnson says, you have the ingredients for some pretty messed psychological and emotional trauma where your sexuality is always under surveillance or doesn't even belong to you. And post-Reconstruction, especially among the Black middle class, there was a desire to be seen as not ignorant, but educated and clean and acceptable. And so they took on Victorian morals. Women would wear long gloves and long dresses and hats. Sanders points out that the statistics show that African American populations use far more cleaning products than other groups. As Sanders said, you just want to smell good to white folk. And you want to be acceptable. And so it's harder to be different, to come out. As E. Patrick Johnson says, it's a different reality for people of marginalized backgrounds. You live a gay life and you don't talk about it. Some people know, a lot of people don't. And if you're already held as a person who's Black or Latinx or Native American, and that brings with it a whole set of responses to you over which you have no control, that have just been imposed on you, you don't have any choice but to live with that because you can't hide it. They both talked about how the Black church was both a haven and kind of an odd place for them to be. Sanders says, I always knew I wasn't going to be teased there. I felt safe there as a young boy, but it was a place where I would hear the word faggot from the pulpit, and that ministers talked about me going to hell for being gay. E. Patrick Johnson says that he was able to be really fully himself. He didn't talk about it. He was safe in the Black church, but he couldn't be fully out. We all live influenced by the structures of society around us. Chasten Buttigieg, Pete Buttigieg's husband, when he came out, was so concerned that his Catholic family in Michigan were going to be incredibly disappointed with him and kick him out. So he'd already packed his bags, he'd been staying with a friend, and then he told them, he came out and he left. A month later, his mother finally tracked him down and said, why did you go? He had just felt that pressure of society, and for many years to come, it influenced how he saw himself and how he came out. I thought it was important to talk to members of this church who are LGBTQ and find out about their experiences. I didn't reach everyone, but many did talk with me. And they all said, yes, it's important to celebrate National Coming Out Day. It's important. One pointed out that if abortion can be ended in Texas, so can same-sex marriage. So can all those protections you get with marriage to be able to make medical decisions, to visit someone in the hospital, to inherit. Yes, we need to talk about national coming out. Another asked me if I was recording, showing me again that in some situations people are freer to be out, but they want to control where that happens. Understandably. Every story, every situation is different. And so I believe each year we should consider what it means to come out. Even though this grand coming out may not seem as accessible to African American men like Sam Sanders and E. Patrick Lincoln, the occasion of National Coming Out Day brought them together for a nuanced, complex conversation. And each year, I think we should go deeper and broader and listen to more voices. And of course, not do it just once a year. I encourage us to go out and listen and value and welcome and encourage a whole person to be with us. I will finish with part of a poem, again by J. Home. It's from Queer is a Calling. And he says, we shouldn't be ashamed. We were called to complete your creation, God. Like the skies, we were shaped by your song. After today's sermon in the sanctuary, several people got up and spoke, but unfortunately, it was muffled and it got cut off. So I want to summarize the little bit more we got from members of the congregation. Howard stood up and spoke about how he got married in this church to another man, and people he didn't even know showed up to celebrate with him. When he came out to his own family, it had been rough, but this church had embraced him, and this is why he still comes back. Sally Carpenter spoke about being in charge of the Poodles for Pride in a gay pride parade. And a man showed up without a poodle, but a beautiful poodle skirt. And so he walked at the head as the marshal, the grand marshal of the Poodles for Pride section, carrying her poodle. And Imogene spoke about how she had yet before this had never met a church that was so welcoming of all of who she was, that she'd encountered progressive ministers before. She had a Methodist minister who took her aside and said, when are you going to get married? You need to do this. I can't do it. And she said, I know, you're 2 years away from retirement, you'd lose your pension. But when they did go to the justice of the peace, the Methodist minister and his wife were their witnesses. And then Molly Anderson, Dr. Molly Anderson, stood up and told a story about her niece deciding to come out to her much older father as she headed off to Smith because she didn't want him to think Smith had changed her or done this to her. Years later, when she called her father to say she was engaged to her girlfriend, she could hear her father yell off in the distance away from the phone, honey, our daughter's going to marry a doctor. We all have had different experiences with understanding and acceptance and celebration. Let us continue to listen and grow and welcome wholeness here. As you go forth from worship today, I hope you will go forth to pause and listen, consider the complexity of what it means to come out, to become your whole self. I hope you will be dedicated to making safe places for those engaged in that struggle, whether that is you or the others you meet. Hear these words from the Reverend Teresa I. Soto, who is parish minister at the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Oakland, California. She says, love is more than saying, love is being and doing. This government may try to find ways to outlaw our existence. Help us to lift up that higher law, the truth, that each and all of us exist as a complete expression of humanity. May it be so.